pilot demands black man, give up seat. He silences the cabin when he reveals he's a federal agent. The cabin lights gleamed on rows of anxious faces, each passenger focused on a safe departure from Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Few guessed that storm clouds of bigotry were about to collide with hidden authority. Whispered rumors rippled through row after row. The pilot, unsteady with resentment, seemed intent on targeting a single passenger, a black man who, to everyone else, was polite and unassuming. What started as a routine flight would become a spectacle of confrontation, rattling the airplane's metal shell with its intensity. No one suspected that, by the end, the power of justice would thunder across the cabin and reshape destinies. Marcus Brown breathed in the cool, recycled air of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport's Concourse B, scanning the crowd for his gate. He was a tall man with a commanding presence, but he carried himself humbly, wearing a simple collared shirt, jeans, and comfortable black sneakers. In the swarm of travelers toting roller bags and children holding worn-out teddy bears, Marcus blended in. He was determined to stay unnoticed, for he rarely drew attention to himself if he could help it. Only a discreet rectangular badge tucked away in his wallet hinted at the authority he possessed as a federal agent. It was a Monday morning, the busiest day of the week for business travel. The harsh fluorescent lights illuminated the bustling scene, flight delays flickering on massive digital boards, lines of people winding like serpents around the TSA checkpoints, and the ever-present echo of overhead announcements. Marcus heard snippets of conversation, someone talking about the big conference in Washington, another discussing layover times in Charlotte. Everyone seemed to be on a mission. He certainly was. He reached gate 27, where his flight, American Airlines Flight 1785, to Washington Reagan National Airport, was set to depart in 2 hours. He found a seat near the windows that overlooked the tarmac. Through the thick glass, he watched ground crew workers load baggage, forklift crates, and guide planes inch by inch until they aligned with the jet bridges. Atlanta's morning sun shone across the runway. For a moment, Marcus felt at peace, reminded of how many moving parts synchronized flawlessly to send travelers safely across the sky. That sense of calm soon evaporated when he heard an agitated voice behind him. Spinning in his seat, he saw a tall man with neatly combed salt and pepper hair. He wore a pilot's uniform adorned with the signature American Airlines insignia on the lapel. His crisp white shirt and gold striped epaulets suggested authority. The name tag gleamed, Captain Thomas Hastings. He was locked in a heated conversation with a gate agent, leaning forward over the desk with an air of impatience, his jaw tightening as if he were chewing invisible nails. Marcus picked up on short bursts of dialogue. "This is unacceptable. Rearrange the seating." "I understand, Captain," the gate agent responded calmly. "But we have a full flight. There are no available seats in first class or business." Hastings exhaled loudly, his frustration evident in every tight muscle across his shoulders. Then he noticed Marcus looking, their eyes locked for a fraction of a second. The pilot's gaze flicked away, but not before Marcus caught a glimpse of something unsettled in Hastings's expression. Shrugging off the strange tension, Marcus returned to scrolling through his phone. He reminded himself he was traveling incognito after all. His real purpose in Washington was classified, and while it wasn't unusual for federal agents to fly commercial, he preferred an uneventful journey. No drama, just a quick flight to D.C., handle some paperwork related to a recent sting operation, then back home. Fate, however, had different plans. An hour later, the gate agent announced pre-boarding for passengers needing assistance, then first class, and eventually the rest of the plane. Marcus waited until his group number was called, then got up and joined the line. A curious hush fell over the gate area. As he stepped forward, he couldn't help but notice Captain Hastings standing a short distance away, eyes narrowed, as if evaluating each passenger that filed past. Marcus wondered whether the pilot was simply scanning for threats, or if it was something else. A primal instinct bristled under his skin. He dismissed it with a silent admonition to stay cool. When Marcus finally reached the agent scanning boarding passes, he offered a polite smile. The device beeped, and the agent handed him his ticket stub. Nothing amiss, no alarm bells, just standard procedure. But the tension that emanated from Captain Hastings was palpable. The pilot seemed to watch Marcus closely, though he didn't say a word. A fleeting thought crossed Marcus's mind. Could this pilot be one of those folks who still harbor prejudices, hidden behind polite smiles and crisp uniforms? He hoped not. He had dealt with subtle and sometimes overt racism before, an experience unfortunately not uncommon for a black man in America. In any case, he wasn't about to let one strange stare ruin his day. Marcus headed down the jet bridge, stepped onto the aircraft, and turned right toward his seat in economy. The flight attendants offered robotic smiles as they directed everyone to their rows. He hoisted his carry-on bag into the overhead compartment above row 17, slipping into the window seat. Settling in, he sighed with relief, thinking this would be an ordinary cramped flight. Some daydreaming, maybe a nap, and 2 hours later he'd be in Washington. If only it were that simple. Passengers began filtering onto the plane in a steady stream, each trying to stow their overhead luggage and wedge themselves into their seats without causing too much disturbance. Marcus watched as a mother, with 2 young kids, wrestled a stroller down the aisle. A middle-aged couple debated whether they should stow their jackets in the overhead bin or just stuff them under the seats. Everyone looked tired, eager to settle in for the flight to Washington. A flight attendant named Sophie bustled about, assisting with seat assignments and directing traffic. She wore the typical navy blue American Airlines uniform, but something about her gentle manner made even the most impatient passengers calm down. Marcus noticed how quickly Sophie apologized for minor inconveniences like seat mix-ups or overhead bins filling fast. She seemed like the kind of person who cared about every detail, determined to maintain order and comfort. In seat 17B, right next to Marcus, settled a man with curly grey hair, dark eyes, and a wrinkled suit that suggested it had traveled one time too many. He introduced himself as Ray, a sales manager who made frequent trips between Atlanta and DC to meet with government clients. Marcus nodded politely, not divulging much about himself. Ray joked about how he never got an upgrade, even though he'd been flying American for a decade. They both laughed, sharing that universal traveler's bond. But the atmosphere shifted when Captain Hastings boarded. Typically, passengers wouldn't pay much attention to a pilot walking through the cabin, especially if the cockpit was at the front, but Hastings strode down the aisle with an unmistakable air of agitation. It was unusual. Pilots generally greet first-class passengers, check in with the cabin crew, then remain in the cockpit for final checks. Instead, Hastings navigated deep into the economy section, scanning each row as though searching for someone specific. Marcus felt that primal prickle along his neck again. He tried to ignore it, focusing instead on his phone, but when he glanced up, Hastings was just a row ahead, glaring in his direction. A hush seemed to ripple around them, as if other passengers sensed the tension. Finally, Hastings paused by row 17 and fixed his gaze on Marcus. "Sir," the pilot said brusquely. "We're going to need you to move." Marcus blinked. He was taken aback. This was no courtesy request to accommodate a family. The pilot's tone had an edge to it. "Excuse me?" Marcus replied calmly. "We need that seat for operational reasons," Hastings stated, and his expression all but shouted, "Because I said so. There's a policy about seat assignments, especially near the wing exits." Marcus frowned. Row 17 wasn't an exit row. He'd deliberately chosen a non-exit seat to avoid the responsibility of assisting in an emergency. "I'm sorry, Captain," he responded, trying to keep his voice measured, "but I selected and paid for this seat. Is there a reason you can't just put me elsewhere if you really need it?" Hastings' nostrils flared. "I'm not at liberty to discuss aircraft policies with you. I need you to gather your belongings and move to the back. There's an open seat in row 29. Marcus exchanged a glance with Ray, who looked just as puzzled. Row 29 was near the lavatories and had a reputation for less recline and more engine noise. More suspiciously, the pilot's gaze was now openly hostile. "I'm fine here," Marcus said evenly. "This seat was confirmed by the gate agent. If you have an operational necessity, maybe the flight attendant can clarify." A hush fell over the surrounding rows, and a couple of people leaned in, listening. Sophie hurried over, sensing trouble. Her eyes flicked between Hastings and Marcus. She swallowed, then offered a small smile. "Captain Hastings, I'm not aware of any reassignments for this seat." "Let me check the manifest." Hastings cut her off. "I've already checked. This passenger must move for safety reasons." Marcus could feel anger bubbling beneath his composed exterior, but he also knew that losing his temper here would only feed into any bias. He took a calming breath, reminding himself of his training: stay polite, stay factual. "Captain Hastings," he began, "could you please show me the regulation that says I need to move from my assigned, paid-for seat?" With a scoff, Hastings tapped the gold stripes on his shoulder. "I am the regulation. Now, gather your things. I won't ask again." Sophie looked mortified. "Captain, maybe we can talk about this. There's no note in the system. That's enough," Hastings snapped. At that moment, Ray stepped in. "Why does he have to move?" the salesman asked, voice quavering slightly, but standing his ground. "I paid for my seat, too. Are you going to make me move next?" Hastings turned slowly, eyes narrowed at Ray. "Do you have a problem, sir?" Ray swallowed. He was no fighter, that was clear. "I just don't understand." The pilot ignored him. Turning back to Marcus, Hastings said more quietly, "I'm not in the mood for a confrontation. If you don't move now, I'll have security escort you off this flight altogether." Everyone within earshot went silent. Sophie looked around helplessly, and even the hum of the aircraft's ventilation system seemed amplified. Marcus felt his heart pound. He wrestled with the desire to stand up for himself versus the risk of drawing too much attention. This was exactly the kind of scenario that escalated into viral videos. A man singled out, asked to give up his seat under dubious pretenses. Marcus had an ace up his sleeve, but he was hesitant to use it. His job was to blend in, maintain his cover, and avoid unnecessary public showdowns. He debated, took a deep breath, and decided it wasn't the time. Not yet. He met the pilot's stare. "I'm not moving," he said quietly but firmly. "If you feel the need to have me removed, go ahead. But I know my rights, and I know airline policy. You have no legitimate basis to force me from my seat." Hastings's expression twisted. It was a mixture of anger and something like fear, but that was fleeting. Without another word, he turned, storming up the aisle back toward the front of the plane. Passengers exchanged looks of concern, confusion, and in some cases, open support for Marcus. They didn't know the full story, but they sensed something was off. Sophie offered Marcus an apologetic glance and whispered, "Sir, I'm so sorry. We don't have any official instructions. This doesn't normally happen." "I know," Marcus said gently. "It's all right." But it wasn't all right. The tension was palpable. Something told Marcus this was only the beginning. The flight might have been delayed already, but the real turbulence was about to begin. The plane's door closed with a resolute hiss, signifying that the flight was officially sealed for departure. No one else was supposed to leave or board unless there was an emergency. Marcus could sense the collective relief of passengers expecting an on-time takeoff. However, the tension from the earlier confrontation lingered in the recycled air. Sophie and another flight attendant, a short man named Carlos, started their pre-flight safety demonstration. They donned bright yellow life vests, pantomimed how to secure oxygen masks, and pointed to the floor lighting that would guide everyone to exits in an emergency. The demonstration proceeded as usual, with most passengers half listening, half fidgeting with their phones. Marcus, however, was fully alert, scanning the cabin for any sign that Hastings might try another tactic. He noticed a couple of passengers eyeing him with curiosity, as though they had guessed something bigger might be in play. Ray, seated next to Marcus, nudged him gently. "You did the right thing," Ray muttered. "I've seen enough flights in my time to know that pilot was out of line." Marcus offered a small, grateful smile. "Appreciate it," he said. He wasn't used to bystanders stepping up like that. Often, people preferred to avoid conflict. The fact that Ray had spoken up spoke volumes. As the flight attendants finished their briefing, the aircraft pushed back from the gate, the whirring motors shuddering beneath their feet. The safety video popped onto the overhead screens, and the plane slowly taxied toward the runway. Outside, the Georgia sun shone brightly, illuminating patches of green grass and the concrete labyrinth of the airport's runways and taxiways. Captain Hastings's voice crackled over the intercom. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Hastings speaking," he began. There was a forced politeness in his tone. "I'd like to welcome you aboard American Airlines Flight 1785 to Washington Reagan. We're expecting good weather on our route today, with an estimated flight time of 1 hour and 50 minutes. Please be seated, fasten your seatbelts, and we'll be on our way shortly." Marcus found it unsettling how Hastings could slip into a professional tone so effortlessly, given his earlier display. It was part of the job, he supposed, but the duplicity of it made him uneasy. "Stay alert," he reminded himself. Something told him that Hastings's resentment wouldn't vanish once they were airborne. The plane lined up on the runway, engines roaring as they throttled to full power. Marcus felt the familiar surge pressing him into his seat as the aircraft lifted off, climbing steadily into the morning sky. Passengers' heads bobbed back. Some chewed gum to relieve the pressure in their ears. Before long, the seatbelt sign dinged off, and the plane reached its cruising altitude of around 30,000 feet. Carlos and Sophie began the drink service, navigating the narrow aisle with a rattling cart. Soft drinks, coffee, tea, and small snack packs were on offer. Ray opted for a black coffee and cookies. Marcus chose water, trying to keep himself hydrated and focused. He had an uneasy feeling in his gut, a sensation that something was about to happen. Midway through the service, a loud beep sounded from the crew's phone at the front galley. Sophie stopped taking orders and answered. Marcus couldn't hear the conversation, but he saw her expression shift, first confusion, then a forced composure. She hung up and whispered something to Carlos. The two exchanged uncertain looks before Sophie continued down the aisle. When she reached Marcus's row, her voice was uncharacteristically shaky. "Excuse me, Mr. Brown," she said, reading his name from her clipboard. "The captain would like to see you in the forward galley." The hush that fell around them was almost deafening. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Is there a problem?" he asked in a calm tone. Sophie bit her lip, looking pained. "I'm not sure. He just asked me to bring you forward." Marcus knew he had to tread carefully. If he refused outright, the situation might escalate further, potentially putting him on the defensive with no allies. But going forward meant stepping into the pilot's territory, away from witnesses. His training kicked in. Always gather evidence. Always have a witness if you suspect foul play. But on an airplane, options were limited. He glanced at Ray. The older man gave him a supportive nod. Marcus sighed, unclipped his seatbelt and stood. "All right," he told Sophie. "Let's see what the captain wants." As Marcus followed Sophie toward the front, a ripple of whispers trailed behind him. The slender aisle felt impossibly long, flanked by curious eyes. When he reached the front galley, Hastings was waiting. He stood near the cockpit door, arms folded, eyes cold. Passenger Brown, Hastings began formally. I understand there might be a misunderstanding. I'd like to offer you a chance to resolve this situation amicably. Marcus met the captain's gaze squarely. I wasn't aware there was a situation. I'm in my assigned seat and following all the rules. Hastings glanced around, noticing Sophie lingering. Flight attendant, could you give us a moment? He phrased it like a question, but it was an order. Sophie faltered, looking at Marcus as if to ask if she should really leave. Marcus gave her a small nod. Reluctantly, she backed away, though she stayed within earshot at the front row of business class. Now it was just the two of them. Hastings leaned in, lowering his voice. Look, I know who you are, or at least what you might be. I've seen the type before, arrogant, always looking for trouble. And I'm not having it on my aircraft. Something clicked in Marcus's mind. He'd encountered individuals like Hastings before, people whose prejudice boiled just beneath the surface, searching for a slight trigger to unleash it. I'm not looking for trouble, Captain. I'm simply traveling to DC. Hastings' jaw flexed. Funny how men like you always end up in seats you don't belong in. The blatant insinuation made Marcus's blood run hot. He fought to keep his voice steady. Men like me? You mean paying customers? Hastings sneered. Smart mouth, huh? I know your type. Probably some thug with a badge or a friend in TSA who let you slip through the cracks. Well, let me be clear, you will not cause a disturbance on my flight. We're far above the ground and you'll do as you're told. Marcus inhaled slowly, controlling his temper. Captain Hastings, I haven't caused any disturbance. You have. I'm sitting quietly in my seat. Is there an actual safety concern, or are you just harassing me? Hastings's expression twisted in rage. Don't you dare accuse me of harassment. I'm the captain. I have full authority to divert this plane if a passenger is non-compliant. Is that what you want? To cause a scene, inconvenience all these passengers, so you can play the victim? Marcus pressed his lips together, refusing to be baited. He decided it was time to establish boundaries. Captain, he said in a voice that barely trembled, I am a law-abiding passenger. I have complied with all regulations. If you think you have the right to remove me from this flight without cause, then land this plane and call the authorities. But be sure you know what you're doing. Hastings blinked, momentarily taken aback by Marcus's calm confidence. Then his face hardened again. I will do exactly that if you don't move. Marcus took a step back. Back to seat 29, right? Hastings nodded curtly. Yes. Why? Why do you need me there? Because that's not a seat you paid extra for, and I don't want you too close to an emergency exit, Hastings spat out, his logic tripping over itself. We're done here. Move, or we land. Marcus hesitated. He'd had enough. If Hastings wanted to call security, so be it. He'd deal with the fallout. I'm going back to my seat, he said evenly. If you have a problem, by all means, involve the authorities. Hastings's face turned red with fury. You'll regret this. In that moment, Marcus decided that once he got back to row 17, he would discreetly text someone about the situation. Stay calm, gather facts, no sudden moves. He'd had training for precarious scenarios, but a mid-air standoff with a racist pilot was never part of the manual. Yet there he was, forging ahead, determined not to let hatred dictate his life. He turned on his heel and walked back to the economy cabin, aware of the eyes upon him. Sophie caught his glance, silently asking if he was okay. Marcus gave a slight nod but said nothing, returning to his seat. The tension was thick enough to cut with a plastic knife. No one knew what had happened up there, but from the grim set of Marcus's jaw, they could guess it wasn't pleasant. He fastened his seatbelt, ignoring the curious stares. Ray shot him a worried look. "Everything all right?" Marcus exhaled. "Not exactly, but I'll handle it." He glanced out the window, seeing the curvature of the horizon in the bright sunlight. He couldn't help but think about the irony. Here they were, soaring above petty, earthbound prejudices, and yet bigotry had found its way into the pressurized cabin. He was certain this wasn't the end of the confrontation. The real turbulence was still ahead. The airplane hummed along at cruising altitude, but within the cabin, tension coiled like a spring waiting to snap. Marcus sat stiffly, arms resting on the armrests, as he stared at the seat back in front of him. It was a feeble distraction from the roiling thoughts in his mind. He debated whether to reveal his federal credentials. Doing so might de-escalate the immediate threat, but it could also blow his cover and set off a chain reaction of inquiries from the airline, local law enforcement, or even the media. Ray fidgeted beside him, glancing from Marcus to the aisle. The man's earlier show of solidarity warmed Marcus's heart, but now Ray seemed apprehensive, as though expecting armed air marshals to burst in any moment. Across the aisle, a kindly-looking grandmother tapped her seatmate's shoulder, whispering something that Marcus guessed was a question about what was going on. 2 rows ahead, a young couple craned their necks, trying to catch glimpses of Marcus. The entire section was abuzz with speculation. Abruptly, the intercom chimed. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Hastings again," a voice drawled. "We have a situation with a non-compliant passenger who refuses to follow crew member instructions. FAA regulations require that all passengers comply with crew requests. We may need to divert if this matter can't be resolved. We apologize for any inconvenience." A low gasp rippled through the cabin. Marcus set his jaw. The pilot was setting the stage for him to be the villain. He could practically feel the eyes accusing him. A non-compliant passenger? Ray turned to Marcus, alarmed. "He's talking about you?" Marcus nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He felt torn between letting the pilot spin a false narrative and stepping forward with the truth. But revealing his credentials in front of everyone might invite more chaos. People would ask why a federal agent was on board, possibly suspecting a terror threat or some other dire reason. Still, the risk of letting Hastings escalate further was growing. With purposeful motions, Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt. He rose and stepped into the aisle, ignoring the hushed remarks and wide-eyed looks. He needed to speak to the flight attendants before Hastings made good on his threat to divert. Sophie was in the front galley, looking troubled as she spoke to Carlos. They fell silent when Marcus approached, their anxiety clear. "Sophie," he said quietly, "I need you to listen to me carefully." She nodded, eyes flicking nervously toward the cockpit door. "Yes, sir. I'm not here to cause trouble. I've complied with every rule. I want you to know something." Marcus pulled out his wallet with deliberate slowness. He flipped it open to reveal a gold badge and ID card from the Department of Justice. Sophie's eyes widened and Carlos's mouth parted in surprise. "I'm a federal agent," Marcus said calmly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not looking to cause a scene, but the captain is harassing me without cause. I need to request that you make a record of this incident." Carlos let out a breath. "Oh my, are you with the FBI?" Marcus shook his head. "Another agency under the DOJ, that's all I can say. Please, keep this discreet. But I won't allow Captain Hastings to violate my rights or airline policy." Sophie swallowed. "This is way above my pay grade." Marcus offered a reassuring smile. "I understand. Just do what you can to keep the peace. And if he tries to force me off the flight or divert, I want you both to know that I will file an official complaint with the FAA and DOJ." Carlos looked at Sophie, then back at Marcus. We'll make a note of everything, but we have to follow the chain of command. The captain outranks us. If he decides to divert." Marcus nodded. "I get it, but I'm within my rights to defend myself from discriminatory treatment. Just do your jobs, and we'll let the process play out." A crackling sound made them all jump. The intercom chimed again. Sophie, Carlos, cockpit. Now, Hastings' voice snapped, echoing through the galley phone. The flight attendants exchanged worried glances before hurrying to the cockpit, leaving Marcus behind. Marcus returned to his seat, where Ray was practically wringing his hands. A swirl of whispers spread through the rows around them. Marcus tried to maintain a composed facade, though inside he battled frustration and an undercurrent of anger. He could only imagine what Hastings was telling Sophie and Carlos behind the closed cockpit door. Minutes ticked by. The hum of the engines and the occasional cough or shuffle was all the sound that filled the cabin. After a tense silence, Sophie and Carlos emerged, their expressions grim. They exchanged a few brief words, and Carlos continued toward the back galley. Sophie moved gingerly down the aisle until she reached Marcus's row. She leaned in close, her eyes flicking up and down the aisle as if checking who might be listening. The captain, he wants to land early in Charlotte. He says you're a security risk and must be removed from the plane. A murmur of shock passed through the passengers in earshot. Ray let out a soft expletive. Marcus clenched his fists. On what grounds? He whispered hoarsely. Sophie looked torn. He says you're threatening him, refusing crew instructions, and that you might be armed. She paused, voice trembling. He's been very insistent. Marcus exhaled sharply, his mind racing. If Hastings diverted, it would cause massive delays and headaches for everyone on board. It would also put Marcus under intense scrutiny. But if he didn't assert his rights, he'd be surrendering to blatant discrimination. Suddenly, he reached a decision. The middle road was gone. It was time to reveal the truth publicly. With measured steps, he stood up once again. This time, he addressed the nearby passengers, raising his voice just enough to carry. Folks, I apologize for disturbing your flight, but I need to clarify something important. The captain has alleged that I'm a security threat. That's simply not true. I am a federal agent with the Department of Justice. He held up his badge for those nearby to see. A ripple of astonishment and relief passed through the onlookers. I've been asked, no, ordered to move from my assigned seat without any valid reason, Marcus continued, calm but resolute. Now the captain wants to divert and remove me under false pretenses. I'm sorry for the inconvenience this might cause everyone, but I refuse to be singled out or intimidated. Passengers began murmuring among themselves, some exclaiming that they'd witnessed the pilot's odd behavior. Others asked questions like, "But why is he targeting you? Or is this even legal?" Ray stood up, a rush of adrenaline clearly surging through him. "I can confirm this man hasn't done anything wrong," Ray announced. "I was next to him the whole time. All he did was refuse to move seats." At that point, the tension in the cabin transformed into something more directed outrage mixed with confusion. A man in row 18 declared, "I saw it, too." The pilot was harassing him for no reason. A woman across the aisle chimed in, "I've been on flights for decades, and I've never seen a pilot treat a passenger like that without an explanation." Marcus looked to Sophie. "Can you please let the cockpit know that I've identified myself as a federal agent? I'd like to speak with Captain Hastings and any relevant authorities on the ground to clarify this situation." Sophie nodded, trying to manage her composure, and hurried back to the galley phone. Meanwhile, Ray whispered to Marcus, "If he lands this plane early, you've got more than a few witnesses to your side." Marcus smiled wanly. It helps to know there are good people out there who won't stay silent when they see wrongdoing. He couldn't predict Hastings' next move. The pilot might still divert, outraged at this public challenge to his authority, or he might double down. But one thing was certain, the confrontation was now in the open. The ball was in Hastings' court, and the entire cabin was watching. A few moments later, the intercom crackled again. Hastings' voice sounded more controlled, but it bristled with forced courtesy. "Passenger Marcus Brown, please come to the front galley." He paused, and one could almost hear the gears of resentment turning in his mind. Will attempt to clear this misunderstanding. Marcus stood, carefully placing his badge back in his wallet. The hushed encouragement of passengers around him felt like a rising tide. No one wanted to be stuck in the sky with a potential confrontation, yet they also recognized injustice when they saw it. Ray squeezed Marcus's arm, a silent show of solidarity. Sophie led him to the galley, where Captain Hastings waited with an even more rigid stance. Behind him stood the first officer, an older woman with keen eyes, her face drawn into a mask of concern. Carlos hovered at the edge of the galley, discreetly keeping watch. Hastings spoke first. "I have been informed that you claim to be a federal agent," he said, his tone heavy with skepticism. "Let's see some identification." Marcus pulled out his wallet again, flipping open his credentials. The first officer leaned in for a closer look, her brows furrowing. Hastings snatched it out of Marcus's hand as though expecting to find a fake ID. He scrutinized it, flipping it back and forth, then handed it brusquely to the first officer. She studied it, then nodded curtly. "It's legitimate," Captain Hastings swallowed. "Well, Agent Brown," he said, spitting the title like it tasted foul. "If you truly are who you say you are, you should have complied with my instructions immediately." Marcus kept his voice calm. "Your instructions had no valid basis. You demanded I vacate my seat without giving any reason other than operational necessity. That's not standard procedure. Then you threatened to remove me from the flight entirely. I have a right to remain in my assigned seat unless there's an authentic issue." Hastings stiffened. "As captain, I'm responsible for the safety of all souls on board. If I judge there's a risk based on what?" Marcus interjected, his tone measured. "My presence as a black passenger who you assume is out of place in row 171717. You never presented any real safety concern, and let's not forget you threatened to divert this plane and have me forcibly removed, even after I identified myself as law enforcement." The first officer cast a wary glance at Hastings, as though silently questioning his decisions. Sophie and Carlos stood off to the side, uncertain how to proceed. The murmur of passengers grew louder from the cabin behind them. Tension was thick enough to taste. Hastings flicked his gaze toward the first officer, clearly seeking solidarity. But her expression remained neutral. Realizing he was losing support, Hastings's face darkened. "Agent Brown," he said, summoning the last shred of civility in his voice, "perhaps we got off on the wrong foot. Let's handle this quietly. You can move to row 29 for the remainder of the flight, and we'll forget about this entire incident." Marcus was stunned at how unrepentant Hastings sounded, as though the pilot believed he was doing Marcus a generous favor. The arrogance bristled in every syllable. "No, Captain. With all due respect, I won't be moving. I paid for that seat, and I did nothing to justify being forced to relocate." Hastings's composure cracked again. "Then I have no choice but to." "Thomas," the first officer interrupted. It was the first time she had spoken. Her voice was low, but it carried an unmistakable note of warning. "We need to think carefully. Diverting or escalating could trigger an external investigation, especially now that we know he's an agent. The airline won't be pleased if we face a formal complaint or lawsuit." A flicker of fear crossed Hastings's face. Marcus seized the moment. "Captain Hastings, you might also want to consider the passengers' statements. Several witnessed everything. If you land early and demand my removal, I'll have to file an incident report with the FAA, Department of Transportation, and my own superiors at the Department of Justice. This situation will become far bigger than just us." The mention of a broad federal inquiry seemed to give Hastings pause. Sweat beaded on his brow, though the cabin temperature was comfortably cool. For a split second, he appeared torn between pride and self-preservation. Finally, the pilot exhaled sharply. "Fine," he muttered. "Stay where you are, but don't cause any more problems." Marcus nodded. I'm not the one causing them, Captain. The pilot bristled, but apparently decided not to retort. He turned abruptly and disappeared into the cockpit, slamming the door behind him. An uneasy silence followed. The first officer gave Marcus a small nod, perhaps of apology, perhaps of relief, and then followed Hastings into the cockpit. Marcus's hands trembled, adrenaline still pumping from the confrontation. Sophie and Carlos released breaths they seemed to have been holding for hours. "Thank you," Marcus told them quietly, "for at least listening." Carlos looked down at his hands. "I'm sorry it came to this," he mumbled. Sophie added, "Just so you know, I'm writing up everything for the airline's internal report." Her voice was laced with regret. "What he did, it isn't okay." Marcus pressed his lips together, offering a soft smile in appreciation of her sincerity. "I'll let my agency handle the rest. I just want to get to DC in one piece." He returned to the economy cabin, where a subdued applause rippled among the passengers who'd overheard or witnessed pieces of the showdown. Ray clapped him on the back, giving a lopsided grin. "Well done, Agent Brown," he teased gently, and there was genuine admiration in his tone. "You've got guts of steel." Marcus took his seat, exhaling slowly. For the moment, it seemed Hastings had backed down. The pilot likely realized that forcibly removing a federal agent in front of dozens of passengers who'd already seen evidence of racial bias wasn't a battle he could win. But the flight wasn't over yet. Marcus sensed there could be more to come after all. Hastings's pride had been wounded, and the seeds of confrontation, once planted, rarely wither without bearing fruit. Still, for the time being, he felt the immediate threat recede, replaced by a hum of conversation and uneasy relief among the other travelers. He gazed out the window, the cotton candy clouds drifting beneath them. He half expected the plane to shudder with the tension that still lingered, but it remained steady. They were hurtling toward Washington at hundreds of miles per hour, carrying a story that had changed shape from a mere seat dispute to a test of justice, dignity, and yes, racial prejudice. As the flight wore on, Marcus forced himself to breathe evenly, quell the anger in his chest, and prepare for the next step. He knew that once they landed, the saga might follow him into the terminal or even into the courts. But he wasn't alone. The difference between a lonely confrontation and a just resolution sometimes was the power of witness and community. For now, though, he settled back into his seat. He closed his eyes, letting the engine's roar lull him into a half-rest. The revelation of his federal status had been forced out of him, but it had also shielded him from a humiliating eviction. A part of him wished the pilot had backed down earlier. Another part, the professional side, recognized that this wasn't just about one seat, it was about making sure no one else endured similar treatment in silence. The remainder of the flight to Washington Reagan National Airport was uneventful from a technical standpoint. The airplane soared over cottony clouds, the sun a bright companion on their journey north. Yet a subdued tension weighed on the passengers, especially those in the economy cabin who had witnessed the earlier drama. Marcus tried to distract himself with the in-flight magazine, skimming articles about the airline's new destinations and business partnerships. Ray alternated between making small talk and checking his phone for emails. Passengers who hadn't dozed off stole glances at Marcus, their curiosity still piqued by the unusual circumstances. Occasionally, Marcus would offer a polite nod, but he mostly kept to himself. Sophie and Carlos proceeded with the snack service, their interactions polite but tinged with apprehension. Each time they passed Marcus's row, they gave him a courteous smile that suggested solidarity. Whatever illusions they'd had of an ordinary flight evaporated when Hastings revealed his agenda. 2 hours after takeoff, the plane began its descent. The seatbelt sign glowed amber overhead, and the flight attendants went through the usual routine, collecting trash, ensuring tray tables were stowed, and seats returned to their upright positions. Marcus watched the ground grow nearer through the window, the patchwork of roads and buildings gradually sharpening into a recognizable cityscape. The Potomac River curved like a ribbon, and beyond it, the outline of the Capitol and the Washington Monument were visible. When the plane finally touched down on the runway with a light thump, many passengers breathed a collective sigh of relief. Marcus knew the real test awaited him at the gate. Hastings had not uttered a single announcement since the confrontation, leaving the usual landing commentary to the first officer. The silence from the cockpit was telling Hastings was likely seething or considering how to handle the aftermath. As the plane taxied to the gate, the first officer once again took to the intercom. "Welcome to Washington Reagan National Airport. The local time is 12:42 p.m. and the temperature is 78 degrees Fahrenheit. We ask that you remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the fasten seatbelt sign is turned off. On behalf of American Airlines, we thank you for flying with us and wish you a pleasant stay in the nation's capital." Not a word from Captain Hastings. Marcus remained in his seat, stoic, until the seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers stood up en masse, collecting belongings from the overhead bins. Ray shook Marcus's hand. "I hope everything works out, man. If you need a witness, you've got my email." He scribbled it down on a business card. "Thank you," Marcus said warmly. "I appreciate the support." The line of people shuffled down the aisle toward the front exit. Marcus hung back, letting the crowd thin out, aware of the possibility that security or airline representatives might be waiting. Sure enough, as he neared the front galley, he saw 2 airport police officers standing there, hands loosely on their belts. Sophie watched anxiously from the sidelines. One of the officers, a tall woman with neatly braided hair, spoke. "Excuse me, sir, are you Marcus Brown?" "Yes," Marcus replied, keeping his posture calm. "May I ask what this is about?" She looked at him evenly. "Captain Hastings requested assistance with an unruly passenger, but we've heard conflicting accounts. We'd like to get your side of the story." Marcus produced his federal credentials again. The officers examined them closely, exchanging quick glances. "I'm with the Department of Justice," Marcus said. "I've done nothing unruly. The captain demanded I give up my seat for no justifiable reason. When I refused, he threatened to divert the flight and have me removed. We can talk more in a private area if you prefer." The second officer, a stocky man with a calm demeanor, nodded. "Yes, sir. Please come with us. We'll find a quiet space to discuss this." Sophie stepped forward, tentatively, addressing the officers. "I'm the senior flight attendant on this flight. I'd like to give my statement too." She shot Marcus a sympathetic look. "And I have a written log." The officers led Marcus and Sophie off the aircraft and into the jet bridge, out of earshot of disembarking passengers. Captain Hastings was notably absent, presumably still in the cockpit or biding his time in the flight deck. The tall female officer asked them to explain what happened from the beginning. Marcus recounted the events calmly and factually, while Sophie corroborated his account. She even showed them her notes, documenting Hastings's demands and Marcus's response. When they finished, the officers exchanged glances. The female officer sighed. "This is a mess. Usually, when the pilot calls, it's because there's a genuine threat. But what you're describing sounds more like a personal conflict or discrimination." Marcus shrugged, controlling the frustration that threatened to surface. "I can't speak to his motives beyond what's apparent." The stocky officer turned to Sophie. "We'll take your statement. If you have contact information for any other witnesses, passengers who'd be willing to talk, that might help clear this up." She nodded. "Yes, I do." The male officer then looked at Marcus. "Are you requesting charges or a complaint?" Marcus inhaled deeply. It was tempting to push for immediate repercussions, but he also knew such matters often required departmental procedures. "I'll be filing an internal report with the Department of Justice and an external complaint with the FAA, and ... Beyond that, I'm not sure yet. I do believe the airline should address this internally as well. The female officer gave a small nod. Understood. We'll write our own incident report. No need to detain you further. But, Agent Brown, expect that you might be contacted by American Airlines or even an FAA investigator. Marcus managed a tired smile. I'm ready for it. Sophie looked relieved that Marcus wouldn't be detained. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her eyes glassy with regret. I love flying, but this was... It's okay, Marcus assured her softly. You did the right thing by telling the truth. Just then, the cockpit door of the plane opened and Captain Hastings stepped out, his expression a storm cloud. He spotted the officers speaking with Marcus, jaw clenching. For a split second, it looked like he might march over, but then he seemed to think better of it. He disappeared down the jet bridge toward the main terminal exit, ignoring them entirely. The officers accompanied Marcus a short distance into the terminal, verifying that there was no immediate need to hold him. They thanked him for his cooperation, apologized for his ordeal, and wished him well. Marcus left them with a respectful nod, feeling a mixture of relief and lingering anger. As he walked through the busy corridor of Reagan National, the usual cacophony of rolling suitcases, gate announcements, and chattering travelers enveloped him. His phone buzzed with new messages, likely queries from his colleagues about when he'd arrive at the field office. He paused by a large window overlooking the runway. An American Airlines jet was taking off in the distance, lifting effortlessly into the sky. A bitter taste clung to his mouth. The planes were supposed to symbolize freedom and possibility, bridging distances in hours. Instead, on this flight, Prejudice had turned a simple seat assignment into a battle for dignity. Marcus closed his eyes, collecting himself. He'd have to file a comprehensive report of the incident and brace for what came next. Possibly a lawsuit, definitely an investigation, maybe media attention if passengers or crew leaked the story. But as he inhaled and exhaled slowly, he also felt a renewed determination. Karma, he believed, had a way of returning in full force. If Hastings had let prejudice guide his actions, there would be consequences. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day, justice would find him. Marcus, for his part, would ensure the wheels of accountability kept turning. He opened his eyes to the bright mid-afternoon sun streaming across the terminal floor. It was time to exit the airport and head to his official business. One flight had ended, but another journey, the pursuit of justice, had only just begun. The next few days passed in a flurry of paperwork, phone calls, and departmental meetings. Marcus spent hours in his Washington, D.C. field office, drafting a report that outlined the entire incident on American Airlines Flight 1785, from the pilot's initial demand that he move seats to the final exchange before landing. His supervisors were stunned. They had known Marcus to be level-headed, never one to instigate conflict. Several of his fellow agents, especially those who had experienced similar microaggressions, expressed their full support. The Department of Justice's legal team requested an in-depth briefing, including any witness statements he could gather. True to their training, they intended to follow proper channels before making any moves. On the airline side, higher-ups at American Airlines launched an internal investigation. Sophie and Carlos were interviewed. Passenger statements poured in from at least a dozen individuals who volunteered to speak on the record, attesting to the pilot's bizarre behavior. Their accounts painted a consistent picture. Captain Hastings had singled out Marcus for no discernible reason, repeatedly attempting to force him out of his seat, then threatening to remove him from the flight. When media outlets caught wind, thanks to a passenger's social media post that described the drama at 30,000 feet, public outrage surfaced online. Hashtags condemning racism in the airline industry trended briefly on Twitter. Some users recalled past controversies with various airlines, fueling the uproar. American Airlines, facing mounting pressure, released a statement that they were aware of the incident and conducting a thorough review. The airline's legal department reached out to Marcus directly, requesting a meeting. Though the Department of Justice normally handled official complaints through formal channels, Marcus's superiors allowed him to attend, provided he brought a DOJ attorney for counsel. In a sleek conference room overlooking the city skyline, Marcus and a DOJ lawyer named Denise Hamilton sat across the table from two American Airlines representatives, Stephen Mills, Vice President of Flight Operations, and Kimberly Moore, Corporate Counsel. Their expressions were polite but guarded. Stephen Mills spoke first, adjusting his tie. "Agent Brown, we want to start by expressing our regret. The passenger experience you had is certainly not what American Airlines stands for. We value diversity, and we have zero tolerance for discriminatory conduct." Marcus nodded, maintaining a calm demeanor. "I appreciate the sentiment, but actions speak louder than words. So far, I haven't heard what disciplinary measures, if any, have been taken against Captain Hastings." Denise Hamilton, the DOJ attorney, leaned forward. "We have multiple witness statements corroborating that the pilot's behavior was racially motivated. Are you prepared to confirm he's been removed from duty pending investigation?" Kimberly Moore hesitated, glancing at Stephen for a cue. "Captain Hastings is on administrative leave," she said slowly. "We are conducting interviews with him and reviewing flight records and crew testimony. Should we find sufficient evidence of discrimination or wrongdoing, we will take appropriate action." Marcus's voice was steady but resolute. "That's a start. However, a significant concern for me and for the department is how your airline will prevent similar incidents in the future." Stephen Mills cleared his throat. "We have mandatory diversity and inclusion training for our employees, including flight crews. We've also implemented stricter oversight protocols following prior incidents. The problem is we can't fully regulate someone's personal bias, though we do try to identify it in the hiring and training processes." Denise Hamilton locked eyes with Mills. "If your training and oversight were adequate, this might not have happened. Our client was threatened in front of a plane full of witnesses. Captain Hastings tried to remove a federal agent for no valid reason other than his own prejudice. This isn't a small oversight, it's a systemic issue." Mills and Moore exchanged uncomfortable looks. Moore finally responded, "We understand the gravity. That's why we want to reach a resolution. We'd like to discuss a settlement if you're open to it." Marcus's heart pounded. A settlement implied financial compensation, but it didn't necessarily guarantee a change in corporate culture. He glanced at Denise, who nodded, understanding his thoughts. "We can talk about that," the attorney said smoothly, "but monetary settlements aren't the only issue at stake." Marcus spoke up. "Exactly. While I appreciate the gesture, I'm more concerned about ensuring that no other person, whether a federal agent or an everyday passenger, faces the humiliation and danger I did." Mills nodded, exhaling. "We hear you. We want to propose not just compensation, but also a revised protocol for conflict resolution on flights with stricter accountability for pilot behavior. We're open to suggestions." Denise and Marcus exchanged glances. This was a more promising direction. Policy changes could help prevent future incidents. They spent the next hour hashing out possible measures, mandatory second officer confirmation before a pilot could demand a passenger relocation, immediate review by ground operations if a pilot cited operational necessity, and mandatory documentation of any passenger's seat changes if prompted by crew. By the time they left the conference room, both sides had a tentative framework for an agreement. The airline would finalize it after internal consultations, and the DOJ would review the final draft for compliance with federal regulations. 3 months passed. The American Airlines internal investigation wrapped up, and their findings were unequivocal. Captain Thomas Hastings had acted improperly, violating both FAA regulations and the airline's code of conduct. While the official report didn't use the word racism, it acknowledged that Hastings's repeated targeting of Marcus was unfounded and potentially indicative of personal bias. Hastings was terminated from his position as a pilot. Marcus consulted with his DOJ attorney, Denise Hamilton, who agreed the settlement was fair and, more importantly, that the policy changes were legally binding. After final signatures and formalities, the ordeal that began at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport seemed at last to be reaching a conclusion. Still, the experience left a lasting mark on Marcus. In quieter moments, he recalled the sting of Hastings's glare, the humiliating demand that he surrender his seat for no reason. He remembered the hush that fell over the passengers, the sense of isolation he felt until Ray and others found their voices to support him. He remembered how he wrestled with revealing his federal badge, concerned about blowing his cover. While the outcome had been just, the journey had been far from smooth. Seeking closure, Marcus decided to do something unusual for him. He shared his story publicly, albeit in measured detail. He wrote a reflective op-ed piece for a well-known national newspaper, explaining how latent prejudices could escalate into dangerous abuses of authority, even in the friendly skies. He didn't name Hastings, but he emphasized the need for accountability in the airline industry. The piece went viral, drawing support from civil rights groups, aviation enthusiasts, and everyday travelers alike. Meanwhile, Hastings faded from the public eye. Rumors circulated that he was contesting his termination in court, alleging it was all a misunderstanding. But with solid witness statements, airline logs, and recorded passenger testimonies, his case seemed weak. Marcus had no desire to keep tabs on him. He'd done his part to ensure that injustice was addressed. Thank you for watching this thrilling drama unfold from a simple seat assignment to a full-blown test of justice. If you found yourself rooting for Marcus and breathing a sigh of relief when karma finally caught up with that racist pilot, then this story has done its job. It reminded us that prejudice can rear its head anywhere, even miles in the sky, and it's up to each of us to stand up, speak out, and demand accountability. So if you enjoyed this saga, or if it fired up your sense of right and wrong, please don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories that shine a light on the courage it takes to fight injustice. Your support helps keep these important conversations alive. Fly safe, stay vigilant, and remember, justice always has a way of taking wing.